fill in the blank?
No, I think I'm done with fill in the blank for the
Okay.
year. I'll stick with multiple choice for the rest of the year.
It's easier on you.
What?
It's easier on you.
What's that? Select all? They're, yeah, they'll be some select alls. The select alls increase in numbers as you go through the program, so by the end of, fourth semester, you'll have lots of select all.
Is the NCLEX, it's all multiple choice, right? Or is there select all on that thing too?
Yeah, there'll be all different kinds. It's mostly multiple choice.
But they're changing it the year we
It's
graduate.
always adapting and updating.
In
And
2020.
they'll have like charts that you have to click through and find data. But for the most part, it's multiple choice. Okay, so we're gonna talk about immunity today. And what is a lab panel that is drawn that will give us information about immunity? CBC, right, complete blood count. And the three main parts of a complete blood count that we care most about are what?
White.
Okay. Complete blood count. Or CBC. Okay, so the main one that we're gonna talk about today is the white blood cells. White blood cells. Okay, or the WBCs. And about how many of those should we have? Okay, 5 to 10. Anybody see anything else? 4 to 11?
I thought the video said 4 to 11.
4 to 11 is usually what I remember. Okay, so 4 to 11, and that's 1,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
4 to 11,000. White blood cells, and they give us what kind of information? If they're elevated,
Infection
there's probably an infection. Okay, and if they're decreased,
and non-compressed.
they're immunocompromised, and they're at risk for infection. Okay, what's another main component that we look at?
Platelets.
Platelets. Okay, and what is our number for platelets? Okay, 150,000 to
400,000.
400,000? Okay, so these are things so far that you should for sure know. Okay, and what's the last component, the main one that we look at?
RBCs.
RBCs, the red blood cells. Okay, and there's other components of that we look at, the hemoglobin and the hematocrit. They're directly related to the RBCs. Typically, the red blood cell is the main one we look at. RBC, and what's the number for that? And you have to be careful because they separate it for men and women, right? Okay, so I kind of try to smudge them together, and I figure about 5, right? About 5 billion, right? Okay, so, but the range is what, 4 to 6, and for men, is it like 5 to 7? Maybe how that was. So I try to remember about 5 billion. Okay, and if the red blood cells, are we more concerned with more often, do the red blood cells go high or low?
It'd probably go lower.
Go lower usually, which indicates what?
Anemia.
Anemia. What's some kind of treatment that we could give for anemia? Iron pills, yep, we've seen that. Anything else?
Do you give oxygen?
Oxygen can help, yeah, if their pulse ox is low.
Blood transfusion.
Blood transfusion maybe if they need it and it's really low. And then there's stimulating factors, injections that we can give to help stimulate production. And does anybody remember what too many red blood cells is called?
Erythrocytoma.
With a P.
Polycythemia.
Polycythemia, and it's too thick and they have to be drained of their blood. Okay, so we know all of those counts, and we'll talk later today. Did you guys read the word pancytopenia? Anybody read that in their reading? Okay, that's something you for sure want to know. Pancytopenia. of those counts are low. Okay, so maybe a cancer patient or a cancer patient who's getting chemotherapy or radiation are commonly what we'll see when we see pancytopenia. Okay, so white counts low, platelets low, red blood cells low. Your patient had that last week. Shaylee had a patient with all of these things, and he was a cancer patient, right? And he had lung cancer? Lots of different types of cancer. He had lung cancer, and he had a pleural effusion, which is what? Fluid in the lungs. So you have two linings in your lungs, and there's fluid in between it. So of course, if there's fluid in your thoracic space, your lungs can't expand like they're supposed to. So he needed to have that fluid drained by a process called, do you remember?
Thoracentesis?
Gretchen
Sorry.
stole your thunder. A thoracentesis. Okay, well, they'll go in with a needle, they'll numb it. A surgeon will do this, not a nurse. Sometimes they'll do it at the bedside, sometimes they'll take him down to a procedure room and drain that fluid. Okay, but because his white count was low and his platelets were low and his red blood cells were low, he couldn't have that procedure done. So we had to wait until they either infused him with blood or platelets or plasma and got those numbers back up. Because with his white count being low, if we stuck a needle in him like that, what could happen? Infection. And with his platelets being low, if we stuck a needle in him, what could happen?
Bleeding. Clot.
He could bleed out. Good, okay. All right, so now we're gonna focus specifically on our white blood cells. And how many different types of white blood cells are there? There's 5 different types. Okay, and after nursing school, you really will not think too much about all the different types. You will just know white count high or low. Okay, so does anybody know what the most type of white blood cells that we have, what they're called?
Neutrophils.
Okay, the neutrophils. Okay, what's the second most common? What is it? The lymphocytes. Okay, and the third most common?
Monos.
Okay, the neutrophils, the lymphocytes, and the monocytes. And then we have, which you don't need to think about at all, are the basophils
Eosinophils.
and the eosinophils. Spelling it wrong.
They're the prettiest.
Eosinophils.
The bright orange.
Aren't they green
Somebody
ones
help
too?
me.
You had it right.
I did have it right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Sinophils.
Yeah.
It's just a funny looking word.
Yeah.
That's right.
There's no I,
No I.
no the S.
Eos. Yeah, there you go.
All right, don't worry about those. Okay, so the neutrophils, what do we know about them? Anything?
The first line, the first cell.
They're the first ones to arrive. Anybody besides Kristen know anything?
That was Autumn, thank you.
Okay.
Thunder. I'm just kidding.
Okay, so they're the first ones to arrive at the scene. Okay, typically we're talking about the inflammatory response, right? So if you get an injury of some type, a paper cut or a sting or anything like that, scrape. Okay, anything else we know about them? How do they help us? What do they do?
Phagocytosis.
They're phagocytic. Okay, so they eat up other cells, right? Phagocytic. Okay, and then does anybody remember, so neutrophils and monocytes are both phagocytic, but there's one main difference between them in that the neutrophils, once they ingest a bacteria, an antigen of some type, after that they die, right? They don't keep going. Whereas the monocytes, they are phagocytic, but they keep living. They go around and can phagocytize cells multiple times. All right, lymphocytes, what do we know about them?
They're the second response.
Okay. What else do we know? They make antibodies.
B cells.
Okay, they make antibodies. Okay, do all lymphocytes make antibodies? What are the two types of lymphocytes that we need to know about? The B's and T's. Okay, also, natural killer cells are lymphocytes. You've read about those. All right, B and T. How do the B cells work? Those are the antibodies, right? They release antibodies. And then what about the T cells?
So the T cells like help produce the antigen. That's right.
They help display the antigen.
Like they have the memory cells and stuff that come to.
T cells can morph into all kinds of crazy things and they kill the cells directly, right? Antibodies. Okay, so your B cells will help release antibodies, which coat the antigen, right? And then our phagocytic cells will come up and eat those antibody-coated antigens. The T cells will morph and kill it directly through apoptosis. Okay, so they'll kind of, in the videos, it like pokes it, and then it causes the programmed cell death. Okay, so and your monocytes are phagocytic, they stick around for a long, long time. You have fixed monocytes in your tissues, and then you have free-floating monocytes. How many of you watched the crash course videos? Okay, we're gonna watch those 3. I hope you had breakfast, because they go really quick. So just try to take a deep breath and pay attention. Try to take notes if you can. If you cannot, then after class you'll want to watch them again and take some notes. Okay, so if you feel like it's going really fast and it's a lot of information, that's normal. I had to watch those videos like 5 times to make sure that I had a really good understanding of it. Okay, so if it's not easy, you don't want to give up, you just want to spend more time on it. And because if you watch those a few times and really understand those, then you'll be good to go. Okay, because that's really as complicated as it's going to get for you as far as immunity and immune processes.
To stop and tell you guys about like Trio. LECTURIO. Lecturio is essentially an online medical school.
You may not know it, but your body is engaged in a never-ending battle. You are literally covered in staph and strep and E. coli and all sorts of dubious characters that are intent on using you and your body's many resources to feed themselves, find shelter, and reproduce as much as they want. And hey, we all gotta make a living. But it is not your job to give these guys a free lunch. So your body has developed a 3-part policy toward these shady customers, and its enforcement is handled by your immune system. The immune system is different from all the other systems we've talked about this year in that it's not a specific tissue, organ, system kind of system. Instead, it involves a whole bunch of different different tissue groups, organ systems, and specialized but widely distributed defense cells. Together, this League of Extraordinary Substances joins forces to perform all of the defense functions your body depends on to keep you alive in an incredibly germy world. And the first line of defense in this never-ending battle, that's your innate or non-specific defense system. Like your average frontline soldier is prepared to immediately engage with anyone suspicious, and it mostly includes stuff we were born with, like the external barricades of your skin and mucous membranes, and internal defenses like phagocytes, antimicrobial proteins, and other attack cells. But some enemies must be fought with special forces, and here your body can deploy your adaptive or specific defense system, which is more like your SEAL Team 6. It takes more time to call in, but it's specially designed to go after specific targets, and it keeps files on those bad guys so it knows how to handle them next time around. But today we're going to focus on your innate system and look at how it uses an arsenal of physical and chemical barriers, killer cells, and even fever to keep you healthy, proving that sometimes the symptoms we associate with illness are actually the signs that we're healing. Just because something is simple doesn't mean that it can't be elegant. I mean, your body is capable of some incredibly sophisticated things, including defending itself from infection. But occasionally, there's something to be said for brute force, and a lot of your innate immune system's functions aren't exactly subtle. For example, your body's very first line of defense is a simple physical barrier, and it works. Like a wall around a fortress, your skin does a fantastic job of keeping out all manner of malevolent microorganisms. As long as that tough, keratinized epithelial membrane doesn't get torn open or busted up too much, you could probably, like, make snowballs out of raw sewage and still be alright. Although, no. Your many mucous membranes also provide a handy physical barrier. You'll remember that they align any cavity that opens up into the germy outside world, including the respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Not only do your skin and mucosa supply simple physical protection, they also pack some serious chemical weaponry. Eat some questionable leftovers for lunch? Don't worry, your stomach is literally filled with acid, so you probably are covered. Walk face first into your coworker's nasty sneeze cloud? No worries, your nasal passages can rip up a tissue box worth of sticky mucus to help trap viruses before they enter your lungs. You've also got bacteria-fighting enzymes in your saliva and lacrimal eye fluid, and peptides called defensins in your skin and membranes that help keep bacteria and fungi from setting up shop around inflamed or scraped skin, which no matter how careful you are, you're gonna get one way or another. Maybe you shave with a dull blade, or you just brush your teeth too hard, and don't get me started about the dangers of bagel cutting. So when you've breached that first simple line of defense, it's time to call on your second line of internal innate defenses. This is where your body starts pulling strategic maneuvers like firing up a fever, releasing chemical signals, causing inflammation, or other defensive tactics that help identify and attack infectious invaders. Some of the first defensive cells on the scene are your phagocytes. Their name literally means to eat, and like Pac-Man, they indiscriminately chase down intruders and gobble them up. And they come in a few different varieties. First, you got neutrophils, which are the most abundant type of your white blood cells. They kind of self-destruct after devouring a pathogen, and in fact, you've probably seen piles of their little dead bodies, because that's what pus is made of. But the bigger, tougher phagocytes are the macrophages. They're derived from monocyte white blood cells that have moved out of the bloodstream to occupy tissues. And some are free types that patrol tissues looking for creepers, while others are fixed, attached to fibers in specific organs, devouring anything suspicious that passes by. So a macrophage, in say the finger I just cut slicing a bagel, sees a new bacterium coming along. It snares it using cytoplasmic extensions, reels it in, completely engulfs it, and essentially digests it and spits the rest out. And unlike neutrophils, it can do this over and over again, like a boss. But not all your defense cells are phagocytic. You've also got cells with what is by far the awesomest name of any cell in the body, the natural killer cells. You can call them NK cells if you want to, but like, why would you do that? Anyway, these tiny assassins patrol your blood and lymph looking for abnormal cells and are unique in that they can kill your own cells if they are infected with viruses or have become cancerous. How do they tell? A normal, healthy human cell contains a special protein on its surface called MHC1, or Major Histocompatibility Complex. But if it's infected, it stops making that protein. And if an NK cell detects a defective cell, it doesn't swallow it whole like a macrophage. It chokes it with an enzyme that triggers apoptosis, or programmed cell death. Pretty awesome. So those are some ways your innate immune cells handle their enemies, but how do they know where to look in the first place? So let's talk strategery. So say you're in a banana factory and you slip on a banana peel and you scrape your knee. movies, your outer fortress has been breached and the pathogens are just flooding in like orcs through Helm's Deep. Banana factories are very dirty places. Now, your body wants to contain the spread of pathogens, clean up the mess, and get healing as quickly as possible, so it cues up your inflammatory response. This is basically an internal fire alarm, only it uses chemicals instead of sirens to get the message across, and instead of smoke and fire, you sense redness, swelling, heat, and pain. For example, in the event of injury, specialized mast cells in your connective tissue send out histamine molecules, and histamine is great at calling in the cavalry. For one thing, it causes vasodilation, which creates redness and heat at the site of the injury. Now, those things might freak you out a little, but they're actually signs of healing. The increased temperature, for example, ratchets up the cell's metabolic rate so they can repair themselves faster. Meanwhile, histamines and other inflammatory chemicals also increase the permeability of blood vessels, causing nearby capillaries to release protein-rich fluids. This causes swelling, which again is actually a good thing because that leaked protein helps clot blood and form scabs, while the lymphatic system sucks up and filters that extra fluid, cleaning it up before putting it back into your bloodstream. And of course, like chub to sharks, an inflamed knee is also going to attract a bunch of local phagocytes, which find it easier to escape your now leaky capillaries, and lymphocytes that are also flowing freely, helping to destroy pathogens while also cleaning up dead cell wreckage. Don't forget, during all this, the neutrophils have been doing their best, but they were the first wave to arrive, so by this time, they're starting to die in heaps. They're triggered when the injured knee skin cells release chemicals that begin leukocytosis, the release of neutrophils from the bone marrow, where they're made, into the bloodstream. To attract the neutrophils to the damaged area, inflamed endothelial cells in the capillaries send out chemicals that act like homing devices. And when the neutrophils arrive, they cling to the capillary walls near the injury, flatten themselves out, and squeeze through the vessel walls to get to work. Your big monocytes eventually roll up to battle and transform into hungry macrophages, replacing the first line of now dead neutrophils and basically just eating up any lingering enemies and then cleaning up the carnage. All this works pretty well in most circumstances, but you may have noticed with a more major injury or an especially nasty virus or infection, sometimes your local troops get overrun. When white blood cells and macrophages run into more foreign invaders than they can handle, they let loose pyrogen chemicals that tap the hypothalamus and raise your body's thermostat, calling in a systemic fever to burn everything. The resulting temperature rise increases the metabolism of your cells so they can heal faster, and it also tells the liver and spleen to hold on to all of their iron and zinc so those things can't contribute to bacterial growth. But even then, sometimes you find yourself facing a more formidable foe. That's when you call in the specialists, your adaptive immune defenses. And to learn exactly how they save the day, you have to watch next time. But for now, you learn that your immune system's responses begin with physical barriers like skin and mucous membranes, and when they're not enough, there are your phagocytes, the neutrophils and macrophages. You also learn about natural killer cells and the inflammatory response, and watch as all of these elements save the day when you slipped on a banana peel. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions.
All right, questions about that video? Did you catch that macrophages were once monocytes? Kind of the same thing. Monocytes morph into macrophages. Okay, so that's innate. You're born with it. Everybody has that type of immune defense. Okay, skin is your first line, right? That's why skin integrity is so important, and we need to identify if our patient is at risk for infection or has impaired skin integrity. Okay, back from nutrition, the stomach acid that we have kills most bacteria that would enter our gut. There's acid in our tears. We have cilia in our respiratory tract that can help prevent any pathogens from getting into our lungs. And then the phagocytosis we're born with of our white blood cells. Okay?
What's true in World of Warcraft is also true in your immune system. To defeat your enemy, you have to know your enemy. Uncover its weaknesses. Learn how to see it before it sees you. We've already talked about how your innate defense system keeps out or quietly neutralizes pathogens without too much fuss. But sooner or later, a threat's gonna come along that's stronger than what the first responders can handle. That's when it's time for the adaptive or acquired immune system to step in. While your innate system takes its zero tolerance policy very seriously and tries to toast any foreign microbe that it encounters, your adaptive system does things differently. It has to be expressly introduced to a specific pathogen antigen and recognize it as a threat before it will attack. As its name suggests, you're not born with a working adaptive immune system. It's slow to act, in part because it takes time for it to shake hands with so many pathogens and get to know them. These introductions may be organic, like touching a dirty faucet in the bathroom or walking into a sneeze cloud, or they may be premeditated, which is why vaccination is pretty much the greatest thing to happen to medicine ever. But once it's been introduced to a potential threat, your adaptive defenses never forget it. And this ability to remember specific pathogens is one of the key differences between the adaptive and innate defenses. Another main difference is that adaptive immunity is systemic, rather than being restricted to a particular infection in, say, a sinus or a sliced finger. Your adaptive system can fight throughout your whole body at once, and does this by deploying one or both of its separate but cooperating defenses, your humoral immunity and your cellular defenses. Your humoral immunity, which you might not have heard of before, works by dispatching important proteins that I'm sure you have heard of. Antibodies. They're made by special white blood cells, and they patrol the body's humors, or fluids like blood and lymph, where they combat viruses and bacteria moving around the interstitial space between your cells. Much of what you know or have heard about or think of when your immune system comes up actually has to do with your humoral immunity. It's why if you had mumps as a kid, you probably don't have to worry about getting it again for the rest of your life. It's also why doctors and nurses and patients who have been infected with the Ebola virus, a disease once thought to be incurable, have lived to tell about it. And it's why vaccinations work. Whether you're protecting yourself from infections or playing an MMO, one of the first steps in any good defensive strategy is to be able to tell your friend from your foe. And in the case of your immune system, that means being able to identify antigens. An antigen could be an invader from the outside world, like a bacterium, virus, or fungus, or it could be a toxin or a diseased cell within your own body. But in any case, antigens are large signaling molecules not normally found in the body, and they act as flags that get the adaptive immune system riled up. So let's say a flu virus gets inside you, and it's floating around trying to find a good host cell to start multiplying inside of. So before it finds that cell, hopefully it will be paid a visit by one of the stars of your humoral response, a B lymphocyte. Like all blood cells, these guys originate in your bone marrow, but unlike other white blood cells, they also mature in the bone marrow too. And as a B cell matures, it develops the ability to determine friend from foe, developing both immunocompetence, or how to recognize and bind to a particular antigen, as well as self-tolerance, or knowing how to not attack your body's own cells. Once it's fully mature, a B lymphocyte displays at least 10,000 special protein receptors on its surface. These are its membrane-bound antibodies. All B lymphocytes have them, but the cool thing is every individual lymphocyte has its own unique antibodies, each of which is ready to identify and bind to a particular kind of antigen. That means that with all of your B lymphocytes together, it's like having 2 billion keys on your immune system's keychain, each of which can only open one door. So part of your immune system's strategy is just to win with overwhelming odds. The more unique antibodies your lymphocytes have, the more likely it is that one will eventually find, bind to, and mark a particular antigen. Once they've matured, B cells colonize or seed your secondary lymphoid organs like your lymph nodes and start roaming around in your blood and lymph. At this point, they're still naive and untested, and they won't be truly activated until they meet their perfect enemy match. Which brings us back to the flu virus. When the right B cell finally bumps into an antigen it has antibodies for, usually in a lymph node or in the spleen, and recognizes it, it binds to it. This summons the full power of the humoral immune response, and the cell basically goes into berserker mode. Once activated, the B cell starts cloning itself like crazy, quickly producing an army of similar cells, all with the instructions for the exact same antibodies that are designed to fight that one particular antigen. Most of these clones become active fighters or effector cells, but a few become long-lived memory cells that preserve the genetic code for that specific successful antibody. This ensures that if and when the antigen returns, there will be a prepared secondary immune response that's both stronger and faster than the first. This is key to why vaccinations are so brilliant and important, which I'll come back to in a minute. But while the memory cells are just there to hang back and record things, the effector, or plasma cells, are packed with extra amounts of rough endoplasmic reticulum, which acts as an antibody factory. These cells can mass produce the same antibodies over and over for that particular invader, spitting them out into the humor at a rate of around 2,000 antibodies per second for 4 or 5 days until they die. And the antibodies they make work the same way that the membrane-bound ones do. They're just free-floating. So they ride the tides of blood and lymph, binding to all the antigens they can find and marking them for death. Now, antibodies can't really do the killing themselves, but they do have a few moves that could make it hard for intruders to take hold. One of their most effective and common strategies is neutralization, where antibodies physically block the binding sites on viruses or bacterial toxins so they can't hook up to your tissues. And because antibodies have more than one binding site, they can bind to multiple antigens at the same time in a process called agglutination. The resulting clumps can't get around easily, which makes it easier for macrophages to come and gobble them up. And not only that, but while all this is going on, antibodies are also ringing the chemical dinner bell, calling in phagocytes from the innate immune system and special lymphocytes from the adaptive system to destroy these messy little antigen-antibody clumps. So the point of all this in the short term is to keep you healthy, but in the long term, this process also adds to your overall immunity. The humoral response allows your body to achieve immunity by encountering pathogens either randomly or on purpose. Active humoral immunity is what we were just talking about. It's when B cells bump into antigens and start cranking out antibodies. This can occur naturally, like when you catch the flu or get chicken pox or pick up some nasty bacterial infection, or it can happen artificially, particularly through vaccination. Most vaccines are made of a dead or extremely weakened pathogen, and they work on the premise that because a secondary immune response is more intense than a primary response, by introducing a pathogen into your body, you're priming it to fight hard and fast should that antigen show up again. In the case of typically non-fatal infections like the common flu, this immunity should at least spare you from some of the most severe symptoms. But in the case of more serious diseases like polio, smallpox, measles, and whooping cough, vaccinations can be truly life-saving. Now, some antigens, like those for mumps or measles, don't really change much over time, so a few immunizations will leave you set for life. But others, like influenza, are constantly evolving and changing their surface antigens, so immunity to last year's flu probably doesn't work against this year's flu. Still, acquired immunity doesn't have to be active. Phage, for example, naturally obtain passive humoral immunity while still in the womb. They receive ready-made antibodies from their mothers through the placenta and later on through breast milk. And that works pretty well for a few months, but the protection is temporary because passively obtained antibodies don't live long in their new body, and they can't produce effector cells or memory cells, so a baby's own system won't remember an antigen if it gets infected again. You can also acquire this kind of temporary passive immunity artificially by receiving exogenous antibodies from the plasma of an immune donor. This is what recently saved some doctors and nurses who had contracted the Ebola virus from infected patients. A serum was made from the blood plasma of other medical workers who had been infected and survived. The antibodies helped defend the patients from the virus before their own active immunity could identify that particular antigen and start creating their own antibodies. It's not the same as a vaccine, which immediately engages your B cells, but it can buy a patient some crucial life-saving time against an infection that would otherwise quickly kill. But B cells and antibodies are only part of the immunity equation. There are plenty of pathogens that quickly worm their way right inside your cells, where they're safer from the humoral response and free to multiply as much as they'd like. Luckily, your immune system has yet another game plan and a new set of players ready to fight that final battle with cell-to-cell combat. Make sure you catch our final episode next week and learn all about this epic battle royale. But as for today, in our second to last episode, you learned how the adaptive immune system's humoral response guards your extracellular terrain against pathogens. We looked at how B cells mature, identify antigens, and make antibodies, and how antibodies swarm pathogens and mark them for death. We also talked about active and passive humoral immunity and how vaccines work. Thank you to our headmasters learning Linnea Boyette, and thank
Can you guys make it through one more, or do you want to take a break? And then, who needs a break before one more of these? You guys are okay? Last one. Okay, so we talked about innate, so the defenses that we're born with. Then we talked about adaptive or acquired, right? For fun, everything has more than one name. Acquired or adaptive immunity. And there's a humoral response and a cell-mediated response. Humoral response is the B cells, and that's what you just watched. Okay, so the B cells release antibodies. The antibodies attach to the antigens. Agglutination occurs, and then phagocytosis of the antigen. Okay, and now the last video is going to talk about cell-mediated immunity with the T cells. Okay, and I'll kind of bring everything together.
We're gynecologists, radiologists, surgeons, internists, pediatricians. We're the #1 provider of doctors in the first year you...
It is time. We have arrived at the final conflict, the Battle Royale, a fight to the Well, hopefully not death, but a big fight anyway. It only seems fitting that we spend this, our last episode of Anatomy and Physiology, talking about one of your body's last-ditch efforts to defend itself at all costs. This is what happens when all the other fail-safes have failed. Your skin and mucous membranes did what they could as physical barriers against infection, and your humoral immune response cranked out antibodies in an effort to keep your interstitial spaces healthy. But when those systems weren't enough, your cells themselves were breached, and pathogens and abnormalities began to run amok where antibodies could not get to them. Now it becomes the business of your cell-mediated or cellular immune response. And that's where stuff gets real, where cell fights cell, and where heroes look like T lymphocytes. These lymphocytes, known in the streets as T cells, go after body cells that have been hijacked by things like viruses or bacteria or become cancerous. T cells cause inflammation, activate macrophages, get other T cells fired up, and generally regulate much of the immune response. Which is important because of all the ways in this course that we have described how you could die, two that we have neglected to mention are what happens if your body completely fails to protect itself, and what happens if your immune system goes rogue and attacks your own healthy cells. But even when they're functioning well, some of your immune cells are careening around your body like miniature biological versions of Mad Max war boys, amped up on signaling chemicals, scouring the terrain for hostiles, and covered from top to bottom the dismembered parts of the enemies that they have vanquished. They're out to protect all of the tissues and organ systems that we've been talking about for the past 46 weeks, and these guys play for keeps.
Does anybody know what Mad Max is?
If there are cells in your body that look and act like they're from some post-apocalyptic hellscape, it's gotta be the cells in your immune system. Aside from the fact that they go around literally eating their enemies and have names like natural killers, some of these cells are dressed for the part too. Specifically, they go around wearing parts of the organisms they've killed so others can see them. Sounds a little bit messed up, but we're talking life and death here. The stakes are high. This kind of behavior occurs both in your innate immune response and your acquired response. We've already talked about how in the innate response, when a phagocyte sees a suspicious character, it engulfs it and kills it, right? But what we didn't get into before is that during its attack, the phagocyte actually breaks the pathogen into tons of tiny molecules and then proudly displays those broken bits in grooved proteins on its outer membrane. These proteins are called major histocompatibility complexes, or MHCs, and they're a lot like how Vlad the Impaler decorated his front yard with the bodies of his skewered enemies, or how a battle-crazed warrior might show off a necklace made of knuckle bones. Because cells from both your innate and adaptive branches do this grisly accessorizing like it's their job, they are referred to as professional antigen-presenting cells. Which might make you think, is there an amateur version of an antigen-presenting cell? And yeah, there kinda is. Every nucleated cell in your body, which means all of your cells except for red blood cells, have one kind of MHC protein on their surface called class 1 MHC. MHC1 proteins present short chains of amino acids that are based on endogenous proteins, that is, proteins synthesized inside that cell. So if a particular cell is healthy, the antigens on its MHC1 tell roving immune cells that everything is okay inside, nothing to see here. But if the cell is, say, cancerous and it's making abnormal proteins, then it'll fix bits of those proteins to its MHC, which alerts immune cells that there's a problem inside and basically asks to be killed. Now, your immune-related cells, like macrophages, dendritic cells, and B cells, wear class 2 MHC proteins on their outsides. These are the professionals. Class 2 MHC proteins bind to fragments of exogenous antigens, like a virus that's been engulfed, broken up, and displayed to get the attention of other cells. And this is how MHCs are totally essential to the cellular immune response. Because the heroes of your cellular defenses, the T cells, can't actually detect whole antigens. They can only recognize them when they're all diced up and decorating an antigen-presenting cell. T cells are made in the bone marrow, but they mature in the thymus, the lymphoid gland that sits on top of your heart, and which is actually what the T in T cell stands for. And you have several different kinds of T cells, but the two you really have to know about are helper Ts and cytotoxic cells. Helper Ts themselves can't kill, but they can activate cells that do, and they help call the shots for the whole adaptive immune response. Meanwhile, cytotoxic cells are the ones that actually do the killing if the cell's gone bad. Now, much like how a naive B cell carries antibodies for one specific antigen, a naive helper T cell has receptors that will only bind to one specific combination of a class 2 MHC and a particular antigen. If that matches right, the helper T bonds to the MHC antigen bit and it gets activated. Then, just like with the B cells we talked about last time, the helper T starts copying itself like crazy, making a few memory T cells as well, which remember that particular antigen should it meet one again in the future. And it also produces a whole mess of effector T cells, mostly more helper Ts, but also some regulatory T cells that I will get to in a minute. But the main thing the helper T cells do is raise the alarm that tells other immune cells that there is a problem. And they do this by releasing a cocktail of chemical messengers called cytokines. When a cytokine enters another helper T, that cell usually starts dividing, making more memory T cells and more helper Ts, which release more cytokines that keep boosting the signal. And some of those cytokines also go on to help activate the cytotoxic T cells. You know that macrophages from the innate system just sort of roll up and swallow pathogens whole, but cytotoxic T cells do their killing a little differently. They roam the blood and lymph looking for hijacked amateur body cells that are asking to be killed. Basically, these infected cells are already dying, so they've digested some of their invaders' proteins and stuck them on some of their class 1 MHCs, effectively waving a surrender flag made of fragments of the very virus or cancer that is destroying them. If a cytotoxic T cell with the right receptor floats by, it binds to the antigen-MHC combination and moves in for a mercy killing. It does this by releasing special enzymes that punch holes in the cell's membrane or otherwise trigger apoptosis, killing both the cell and whatever is inside of it. Then the cytotoxic cell just detaches and continues to run down other prey. So by now it should be pretty obvious that without T cells, there basically is no adaptive immune response, and it really all comes back to the helper Ts, which is why immunodeficiencies can be so deadly. AIDS, for example, is caused by the human immunodeficiency virus that specifically attacks helper T cells, and without the helper Ts, there wouldn't be much of a humoral response either, because the cytokines that come screaming out of the helpers not only activate other T cells, but they also finish the training of the B cells. The fact is, most of your so-called naive B cells don't get fully activated and become memory or effector cells when they first bind to an antigen. And there's a reason for that. Since antibody receptors are generated randomly, you might wind up with B cells that could bind to your own healthy proteins, like, say, your growth hormone. So once a B cell interacts with a substance, whether it's growth hormone or some dangerous bacterium, it still needs to bind to it, engulf it, and present some fragments of it on its surface. But then it'll stop to await inspection. It pauses until the right helper T cell comes by to check out its presentation. If the T cell binds to the presented fragment, then it releases cytokines which fully activate the B cell, and suddenly you got antibodies going everywhere. But if it doesn't, then the B cell just goes about its business and doesn't trigger an immune response. This check and balance between B's and T's is an important safeguard against your immune system becoming too good at its job, which is a very real risk. A hyperactive immune system can cause mayhem by losing its ability to distinguish enemy from self as it turns on your own body. Your regulatory T cells, another type of effector, help prevent this by releasing inhibiting cytokines that tell other immune cells to stand down once the initial threat has been handled. Without that regulation, the body might start cranking out too many antibodies and cytotoxic cells that could damage or destroy its own tissues. This dangerous confusion is what causes many autoimmune diseases, like multiple sclerosis, which eats away at the myelin sheaths around neurons, or type 1 diabetes, which tears up the pancreatic cells that make insulin. So the takeaway here is that your immune system is usually really good at its job, which is to kill stuff in the name of keeping you alive. And you really don't want it to go rogue on you, because if there's one thing you should have learned in the past year with us, it's that your body is both resilient and fragile, and it survives only when the sum of its many complicated parts stays balanced and works together. And that is the glorious wonder of you. As we wrapped up our tour of the immune system today, you learned how the cellular immune response uses helper, cytotoxic, and regulatory T cells to attack body cells compromised by pathogens. We looked at how cytokines activate B and T cells, and what happens if your immune system goes rogue and starts causing autoimmune trouble. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Hoyev, and thank you to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly...
All right, any questions about the T cells and the cellular-mediated immunity? Apoptosis?
So if the B cells or whatever, if they don't get seen by the helper T cells, they don't do anything? Like this?
Right.
Okay.
So all of this is occurring at the same time. So you can see why nutrition is so important and why it's so good to be hydrated with water, because all that is